Welcome to Fight News Now Extra. I'm John Pollock with John Ramdeen and Robin Black coming up to chat lots of news today, including tons of fights being announced by the UFC, a big show coming to Fox in January, and we'll hear from Bellator commentator Jimmy Smith. Bellator is getting set for their big card on Saturday night on Spike TV, headlined by Tito Ortiz and Stephan Bonnar. Jimmy Smith was on the MMA Report this week and chatted with me about filming the winner-take-all special, which ran on Spike this past week, and the legitimate tension between Tito Ortiz and Stephan Bonnar.
I'll tell a story. We were in between shoots, and these guys really couldn't be around each other, like in between shoots. It's not like they turned it off when we weren't shooting. I mean, they couldn't be around one another. They couldn't look at one another. And so we're sitting at the table one time, and Tito's to my right, and Stephan Bonnar's to my left, and I'm talking to the director about, where we're going with the segment, and I heard this sound. It was like somebody was knocking on the table, and I look over, and Tito is clicking his jaw so hard that I could hear it, and he's staring at Stephan Bonnar. He's grinding his teeth so hard that I thought someone was hitting the table, and I thought the sound guy was going to come over and go, you got to stop that. We can hear that. I really thought they were going to hit each other when we were doing the piece, and me and the director had to sit down and literally go, guys, we can't have this blowing up to the point where you hit one another. And we had to literally sit them down and go, don't hit each other, don't fight right now. We got to keep the tension high without you guys hitting one another. We were really concerned, and I was concerned with the director about it kind of going off the rails and having kind of a free-for-all in there, which nobody wanted. So we really had to avoid that. They really dislike one another that much.
The UFC has announced a return to Sweden on Saturday, January the 24th for the UFC on Fox 14 special. The card will be headlined by a light heavyweight bout between Alexander Gustafsson and Anthony Johnson to determine the next title challenger at 205 pounds. The show will take place from the Tele2 Arena, which holds 30,000 people. Also confirmed for that same Fox card in Sweden is a middleweight bout between Dan Henderson and Gegard Mousasi. Henderson has not fought at 185 pounds since his loss to Jake Shields back in April of 2010, which also took place on network television. Henderson has lost 4 of his last 5 fights, while Mousasi is coming off a submission defeat to Ronaldo Jacare Souza from this past September. It was announced on UFC Tonight that a women's bantamweight bout between former title challengers Miesha Tate and Sarah McMahon has been added to the UFC 183 card on January the 31st in Las Vegas, which is headlined by Anderson Silva and Nick Diaz. Tate has picked up 2 consecutive wins heading into this bout with wins over Liz Carmouche and Rin Nakai, while McMahon last fought in August, taking a split win over Lauren Murphy. And another UFC fight that was revealed by Ariel Helwani on UFC Tonight is a heavyweight bout between Frank Mir and Antonio Bigfoot Silva for February the 28th in Los Angeles at UFC 184. Mir has not fought since this past February, where he dropped his 4th straight fight and is in search of a much-needed win. Silva was serving a drug suspension after his draw with Mark Hunt last December and returned in September, where he was stopped by Andrei Arlovsky in the opening round of their Fight Night main event. Here we are with John Ramdeen and Robin Black. I'm looking ahead to Saturday, guys, and it's really nutty when you look on paper at what's going down on Saturday. I'm overwhelmed at this point. Like, we knew that this was happening. I think there is one card too many on Saturday night, and I'm curious if the fan base, the average fan that might have watched a World Series of Fighting card, those 200,000 viewers they typically get, are they going to be watching World Series of Fighting on Saturday night? Because I think that no one is going to be watching that particular card.
Well, on Saturday night, no, but you're telling me that on Sunday, you're not going to go back and look at Justin Gaethje versus Melvin Guillard?
We are not the rule. We are the exception.
Sure. But look at the thing about mixed martial arts is it's been built on the hardcore fan base for years
and years. It's like being drunk on Saturday night and waking up Sunday and hitting the bottles again, man. Like, maybe
when I was younger. Do that? Lots of people do that.
Well, maybe in Barrie, Ontario, that still happens on a regular basis.
Hey, listen, why is sports such a desirable property in television? Because it's appointment viewing. You got to watch it in real time. If the Green Bay Packers don't beat the Toronto Maple Leafs or whatever happens in other sports, I don't know nothing about that. That night, you'll hear about it, and you know what you want to do the next day? You want to see the interception, or you want to see the basket or whatever. And I think it's the same thing. Are people who are really, really into MMA going to watch Melvin Gillard the next day. Well, if they hear online that that was a great fight, they'll cherry pick a fight or two. That doesn't help NBC. It doesn't really help the World Series of Fighting. It helps the viewer.
Well,
but
that's their responsibility. They see, well, there's a UFC on this night, and there's a Bellator event on this night, and a Cage Warriors event. You know what we should do? Have a show the same night.
Let's do it on Sunday.
On the World Series of Fighting.
Yeah,
they could have had it on the Friday. They could have had it on the Sunday.
They're doing it again next month, going against the Fox special from the UFC. So, I mean, this is kind of become now a tactic where I think it's more NBC Sports Network is programming this, and World Series of Fighting, they have to acquiesce to whatever the network wants.
100%. They don't have pull. Let's look at the history of World Series of Fighting, and I try to lay it out. Well, I mean, the modern, what we have.
2 years.
I try to lay it out fairly and honestly, and I have no bias against the World Series of Fighting. In fact, I like it. In fact, we get to call the World Series of Fighting Canada. So this is analytical, but they went in and they bought television time. And by buying time, they said, we're a fight company with TV. That means something. Let's sign these fighters. Let's put on these shows. But a lot of it is really the work of business people trying to structure something that feels big enough that eventually it will become big enough. But analytically speaking, that's not really possible when you have two giants in Viacom and the UFC already doing that. So I feel like this is something that somebody will lose a bunch of money if NBC fills in some programming, if some fighters get some fights, if we get entertaining fights, we're all happy. But somebody somewhere is getting burned.
Let's take a look at some of the fights that have been announced for January. January 24th, they'll be on Fox that night. 30,000-seat arena in Sweden, having the right guy on top with Alexander Gustafsson taking on Anthony Johnson, and then Dan Henderson cutting back down to 185 pounds. He will meet Gegard Mousasi. I imagine World Series of Fighting will run a card that night, probably in Sweden. But we've got certainly an eliminator bout here for the light heavyweight championship picture with Johnson returning and Gustafsson. This should be quite the spectacle on Fox, a 30,000-seat arena, which I think they have the ability to fill.
Yeah, number one, from a fan's perspective, this is an outstanding matchup. A++ home run for the UFC. You're talking about two of the top dogs at 205 pounds. We all have seen how talented and how evolved Alexander Gustafsson is. And we've seen that, okay, Anthony Johnson at 170 pounds is not even remotely close to the Anthony Johnson we have at light heavyweight. And I think the dangerous part is you're putting Gustafsson up against a legitimate guy at 205 pounds in his home territory. I don't know if this is the best move because Anthony Johnson can 100% win this fight.
For sure. Both guys can win it. It's interesting. Gustafsson, when he was fighting Shogun, when he was fighting Silva, he was developing, very smartly, developing a game that would make him competitive and maybe beat John Jones. A range game, understanding the different distances, all of this. They seem to create him as a Jones killer. That don't work against Anthony Johnson. Totally different fighter, totally different fight. Fights on the inside, fights from balance, everything is with power. It's a spectacular 205-pound matchup. I can't wait for it.
And finally, Frank Mir and Antonio Bigfoot Silva, they will be fighting February the 28th. Mir has lost his last four. Antonio Silva, I mean, he just looked like a depleted fighter. He was coming off of testosterone in his last fight against Andrei Arlovsky. I think must-needed win for both guys here, even in this era where you can have a lot of losses if you have a name attached to yourself.
You just have to go out and put on a good show, both Bigfoot and Frank Mir. And, you know, I think if you ask most people, they have no idea that Frank Mir has lost the majority of his last number of fights. Just come out, put on a show, and you'll still have a job. They need stars.
All right. He is Robin Black, John Ramdeen. I'm John Pollock. We have more of Fight News Now Extra, and it is coming up right now.